Hello, everyone. My name is Marcos Delgado, and I'm here to discuss the use of cultural burning to stimulate biodiversity and mitigate impacts of fire suppression campaigns in California. Now, first off, I'm going to set the scene on why biodiversity needs to be stimulated in California and how cultural burning can be a useful tool to stimulate it. Starting with how devastating wildfires have been occurring more frequently and with greater severity in California over the recent years. And this is due to a number of reasons, including climate change, as well as previous fire suppression practices. In addition to that, fire suppression campaigns aimed at extinguishing all wildfires as quickly as possible have had unintended consequences. One of those consequences being the loss of ecological diversity. Next, we'll talk about cultural burning, also known as prescribed or traditional burning, which is a practice that has been used for thousands of years by indigenous people in California and other regions. We will also discuss how cultural burning can be a useful tool for decreasing the effects of wildfires and the need for more forceful fire suppression techniques. And lastly, an important piece of this topic is how cultural burning has both cultural and social significance for indigenous communities. And by honoring traditional knowledge and practices, cultural burning can help promote cultural preservation as well as community engagement between us and the indigenous communities. Furthermore, this topic also has environmental justice impacts as well, starting with how the impacts of wildfire suppression policies are not evenly distributed across communities from different backgrounds. And once again, the indigenous communities' cultural practices get thrown out of the window and their way of life is completely altered. This is because indigenous people in California have utilized cultural burning for thousands of years as a tool for controlling ecosystems and fostering ecological knowledge. And not only do these fire suppression campaigns have negative social impacts, but real ecological ones too, because the previous stewards of our land knew the importance of controlled burning in an ecosystem and how to best go about implementing it. Which leads me to how one of the key impacts of these policies has been the loss of traditional ecological knowledge and practices among indigenous communities. And by preventing cultural burning, fire suppression policies have limited opportunities for indigenous peoples to practice and transmit their traditions as well as knowledge of ecological management. And ultimately, all of these effects, all of this affects wildfires because due to fire suppression tactics, fuel has accumulated and many ecosystems have lost biodiversity as a result of the loss of traditional ecological knowledge and practices, which is why ecosystems are more vulnerable than ever to catastrophic wildfires. Buildup for fuel fires and the lack of proper attention has already caused many ecosystems to be burnt and lose ecological diversity. Now, transitioning to the relevancy to our class material, starting with how cultural burning is strongly tied to environmental justice concepts, which demand that all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic level, have equitable treatment and meaningful participation in environmental decision-making. And the indigenous culture has been strongly left out of the decision-making for far too long. So by recognizing and supporting cultural burning, it can promote environmental justice by empowering indigenous communities in the management of their own land. Along with that, the history of fire suppression policies in California is tied to the broader history of westward expansion and industrialism in the United States, which ultimately prioritized resource extraction and economic gain over anything else, including ecological sustainability and cultural diversity. And lastly, traditional ecological knowledge and practices related to cultural burning are often gendered, with different roles and responsibilities assigned to men and women. And by recognizing and supporting the diversity of gendered ecological knowledge, cultural burning can help to achieve more gender equity, which directly relates to the themes we have discussed during this course. Moving on to the key issues revolving around the cultural burning and the fire suppression campaigns, starting with the recognition and revitalization of traditional ecological knowledge. This topic of recovering traditional ecological knowledge is so important because it has the potential to not only lift indigenous communities, but also the environment, which leads me to the main goal of today's discussion, which is to address the issue of these catastrophic wildfires over the recent years, which can ultimately be best achieved with the collaboration between indigenous communities and the government. Next, moving on to the environmental impacts of wildfires, as well as previous fire suppression policies. Starting with the loss of biodiversity due to catastrophic wildfires. This is a pressing issue because it can have significant and long-lasting impacts on the health and resilience of an ecosystem. This is because biodiversity is essential for the functioning of an ecosystem as it provides a range of ecosystem services. Another environmental impact to be aware of is how climate change effects have resulted in higher temperatures during the summer months, which can massively impact the frequency and intensity of wildfires, which we have seen over the last couple of years. And lastly, this leads me to the environmental justice impacts, which I want to bring up the historical and ongoing impacts of colonization and how the suppression of cultural burning practices was a result of colonization and genocide of indigenous peoples, as well as the control over land and resources by European settlers. But the promotion of cultural burning can be seen as an act of resistance against these historical and ongoing oppressions. This all leads me to some possible solutions, beginning with how incorporating cultural burning practices into fire management strategies, which will promote healthy ecosystems with the goal of mitigating the impacts of fire suppression. Fostering partnerships with indigenous communities, which with the aim to integrate traditional ecological knowledge in the most respectful way possible. Next, developing and implementing controlled burn programs, which will reduce fuel buildup and promote biodiversity. Provide training and resources to land managers, communities, and private landowners to safely and effectively implement cultural burning practices. Invest to better understand the ecological impacts of fire suppression policies and the effectiveness of alternative management strategies. And lastly, address institutional barriers and biases that may prevent integration of cultural burning practices into fire management policies and strategies. Now, lastly, are my overall takeaways from reading and researching about my topic. The first key takeaway being the importance of incorporating the indigenous community into the process of purposeful burning. Another aspect of this topic I found very impactful was recognizing the influence that colonialism has had on getting rid of original stewards of our land, as well as the importance of making changes in ecological management with the goal of helping the environment over anything else. Before I wrap up, I want to discuss the relevancy to my future career path, which by exploring and promoting the use of cultural burning practices, environmental studies majors can contribute to more sustainable, equitable, and culturally sensitive approaches to environmental management and restoration. And that concludes today's presentation, and thank you so much.